The year was 1866, and the winds of war swept across the German states like a bitter frost. In the heart of Prussia, the air was thick with ambition. King Wilhelm I and his iron-willed chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, stood at the precipice of history, their eyes fixed on a unified Germany under Prussian might. The sprawling fields of Brandenburg, dotted with swaying wheat and scarred by the boots of drilling soldiers, hummed with the promise of conflict. The Austro-Prussian War loomed, a clash that would reshape Europe's destiny. In a small village nestled along the Elbe River, a young blacksmith named Karl Müller hammered iron in his father's forge. His broad shoulders glistened with sweat as sparks flew, each strike of his hammer a defiant beat against the uncertainty of the times. His sister Liesel watched from the doorway, her blue eyes clouded with worry. "They say Bismarck's plotting something big," she murmured, clutching a letter from their cousin in Berlin. "War's coming, Karl. I can feel it in my bones." Karl paused, wiping his brow. "Let them plot. I've got iron to shape and a family to feed." But his words belied the unease in his chest. The village square buzzed with rumors. Austrian troops massing in Bohemia, Prussian regiments marching south, and Bismarck's cunning schemes to outwit his rivals. Karl's life, once bound by the rhythm of hammer and anvil, was about to be forged in the fires of war. The conscription notice arrived at dawn, nailed to the village's ancient oak tree. Karl's name was scrawled in stark black ink, alongside a dozen others. Liesel wept as he packed a small bundle, her hands trembling as she pressed a locket into his palm, a keepsake with a faded portrait of their late mother. "Come back to me," she whispered, her voice breaking. The Prussian army was a machine of precision, its soldiers clad in dark blue tunics and spiked helmets that gleamed under the summer sun. Karl, now a reluctant infantryman, trained under the barking commands of Sergeant Braun, a grizzled veteran with a scar slashing across his cheek. "Move faster, Müller!" Braun bellowed as Karl stumbled through drills, his hands more accustomed to a hammer than a rifle. Yet there was no time for weakness. The Austrians, with their white-coated regiments and Habsburg pride, were gathering strength, and the clash at Königgrätz was imminent. At night, by the flickering light of campfires, Karl listened to his comrades' tales. There was Hans, a wiry farmer's son who dreamed of glory, and Friedrich, a poet who scrawled verses about death and honor in a tattered notebook. They spoke of Bismarck's gamble, a war to crush Austria's influence and unite the German states under Prussia's iron fist. Karl, though, thought only of Liesel and the forge he'd left behind. The march to Bohemia was grueling. Mud clung to Karl's boots, and the summer heat pressed down like a heavy hand. The Prussian army moved with relentless discipline, their Dries needle guns slung over their shoulders, a weapon said to fire faster than any Austrian musket. Karl's heart pounded as they neared the rolling hills of Königgrätz, where the fate of nations would be decided. On the eve of battle, a dense fog blanketed the camp. Karl stood watch, his breath visible in the chill air, when a shadow emerged from the mist. It was Friedrich, his face pale. "I overheard the officers," he whispered. "The Austrians outnumber us. If we fail tomorrow, Prussia falls." Karl gripped his rifle tighter, the weight of his country's future pressing against his chest. At dawn, the fog lifted, revealing a sea of white-coated Austrian troops across the valley. Cannons roared, shaking the earth, and the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Karl's regiment charged, their blue ranks slicing through the chaos. The needle guns spat fire, cutting down Austrians with terrifying efficiency. Karl's hands shook as he reloaded, his ears ringing with the screams of the wounded. The Battle of Königgrätz was a maelstrom of steel and blood. Karl fought mechanically, his world narrowed to the next step, the next shot. Hans fell beside him, a bullet through his chest, his dreams of glory snuffed out in an instant. Friedrich, clutching his notebook, shouted poetry over the din, as if words could shield him from death. Karl pushed forward, driven by a primal urge to survive. In the chaos, he glimpsed a Prussian officer on horseback, his saber flashing as he rallied the troops. It was General von Moltke, the architect of this campaign, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the carnage. Karl's heart surged with a strange pride. Prussia's might was undeniable, even as the ground grew slick with blood. By dusk, the Austrians were retreating, their lines shattered by Prussian precision. Karl collapsed in the mud, exhausted but alive. The victory was decisive, but the cost was staggering. Friedrich sat beside him, his notebook stained with dirt. "We won," he said softly, "but at what price?" The war ended swiftly after Königgrätz, with Austria humbled and Prussia ascendant. Karl returned to his village, his uniform tattered but his spirit intact. Liesel ran to him, tears streaming down her face as she clutched the locket he'd carried through the war. The forge stood silent, waiting for his hands to bring it back to life. Yet the victory felt hollow. The village mourned its lost sons, and Karl carried the weight of Hans's death and Friedrich's haunted eyes. Bismarck's dream of a unified Germany was closer, but whispers of new conflicts, against France perhaps, already stirred the air. Karl knew the forge would never be the same, not with the echoes of war still ringing in his ears. 4 years later, in 1870, the drums of war sounded again. Bismarck's machinations had provoked France, and the Franco-Prussian War erupted. Karl, now a seasoned soldier, was called back to serve. Liesel begged him to stay, but duty and a flicker of pride in Prussia's cause drove him to the front. The fields of Sedan were a different beast from Königgrätz. The French, led by Emperor Napoleon III, fought with desperate valor, but Prussia's war machine was unstoppable. Karl's regiment encircled the enemy, their artillery pounding the French lines into submission. In a moment of surreal clarity, Karl saw Napoleon III himself, a defeated figure surrendering his sword. The empire fell, and Germany's unification was sealed in blood. Karl returned home for good in 1871 as the German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The village celebrated, but Karl's heart was heavy. He had seen too much death, too much destruction. At the forge, he hammered iron with a new purpose, not just to craft tools, but to build a future for Liesel and the family they might one day have. Friedrich visited one crisp autumn day, his notebook filled with poems of war and peace. "We've made history, Karl," he said, a wistful smile on his face. "But it's up to men like you to shape what comes next." Karl nodded, his hammer striking true. The wars had forged him, just as he forged iron, into something stronger, tempered by loss and hope. Years later, Karl stood in the village square, now a father and a respected craftsman. The German Empire thrived, its borders secured by the wars he'd fought. Liesel, married to a kind merchant, often visited with her children, who played around the ancient oak where Karl's conscription notice had once hung. As he watched the sunset over the Elbe, Karl thought of Bismarck, Moltke, and the countless souls who had shaped this new Germany. The Prussian wars were a distant memory, but their legacy lived in the unified nation and in the scars Karl carried. He placed a hand on the locket, now worn from years of wear, and smiled. The Iron March had ended, but its echoes would resonate for generations.